Okay, so we start?
Yeah, you can go ahead and start, Partha.
All right. Okay, so thank you everyone, and welcome to the final session of this webinar series for this fall semester. I'm Partha Mukherjee from Purdue University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you again, and also to this very concluding most to the organizing committee, and especially a big shout out to Ben for his tremendous efforts in organizing everything. So thank you, Ben. And also to Devesh for his leadership on this. Next slide, please. So today's theme is energy storage and materials and mechanics focused. I would let our moderator introduce our two excellent speakers. But my job here is to introduce the distinguished moderator of this session. So with that, let me welcome and introduce our moderator, Professor Sabarjit Banerjee from Texas A&M University. He is currently the Davidson Chair Professor of Chemistry and also a Professor of Material Science and Engineering. And he's also a Chancellor's Fellow. I would like to say a few things among his many achievements and many accomplishments. So he was MIT Review's 35 under 35, and also a recipient of multiple awards, but at least two I'll formally announce, as Rosenhan Medal and also the Bilby Medal. He is currently a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and also Institute of Physics. His research is currently focused on electron-correlated solids, metastable materials, and storage, and also broad spectroscopic and synchrotron level analysis. So with that, a lot of science engineering.
Thank you very much, Partha, for a very kind introduction. And I'm just going to start by showing maybe one slide, if I can. And let's see if this works out. Okay, so, this has been a pretty stressful semester for most of you, for almost everybody. So it seems appropriate to end this end the semester, end the series of talks this semester, thinking about stress and thinking about batteries, which are under a lot of stress, perhaps even more stress than we've encountered this semester. And as someone who got into batteries a few years ago, we always knew, you've seen Breaking Bad, that the chemistry must be respected, but very quickly we've also learned that the mechanics must be feared if you want something that is a die-hard battery, something that's going to last a really long time. And oftentimes the failures come from mechanics. And this is a problem that is incredibly rich, both from a fundamental science and a technology innovation perspective, and incredibly complex as the sort of series of the different types of battery chemistries become more and more diverse in different applications, from intercalation batteries to conversion chemistries, and all sorts of materials and interfaces get into go into making new types of energy storage systems. Understanding the mechanics of all of these materials as well as all of these interfaces becomes especially important. And in two people, it's a real joy for me to introduce two people who really taught me to fear the mechanics less. I've learned a lot, and my research group has learned a lot from their work, and so it's a real pleasure to introduce Matt McDowell and Matt Pharr, who have really carried the flag for understanding this interface of chemistry and mechanics. I'm going to let's start by introducing our first speaker, which is going to be Matt McDowell. So Matt is an assistant professor at Georgia Tech with appointments in the Woodruff School of Mechanical Engineering, as well as the School of Materials Science and Engineering. He received his PhD from Stanford University in 2013 was a postdoc at Caltech until 2015, and in his independent career, he's really had a trailblazing career where he's won the PCASE Award, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the Sloan Research Fellowship, actually in chemistry, I believe, and the NSF Career Award, the AFOSR Young Investigator Award, and the NASA Early Career Faculty Award. So we're super excited to have him as our first person kicking this off. And I think I'll introduce Matt at the just before he talks, right? So meanwhile, if you've got questions, please feel free to keep putting them in chat. We'll keep questions till the end of both seminars. Okay, so Matt, the floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Sabarjit, for the very nice introduction. I hope you can all see my screen here. All right. Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Matt McDowell, as Sabarjit mentioned. I want to say this has been a really nice seminar series this semester. And, even though we're all at home and, not going on campus very much, I think it's really served the purpose of building community, the wider community and mechanical engineering departments, understanding what other folks are doing. So it's been great this semester. So I'll get started here. So my talk here is going to be about the chemo-mechanics of active materials and interfaces in batteries. And I'm very excited to share some new work, actually, that I haven't presented before that's just about to be published as part of this. Also, I want to say that if you don't know anything about batteries, that's okay. You don't really need to know a lot about electrochemistry to appreciate this talk, I hope. Okay, so just briefly, this is my research group here at the bottom. About 80% of my group works on batteries and materials in batteries and chemomechanics in batteries. And some of the projects that we have are shown over here. I also have some other work on dynamics of layered materials and understanding using in-situ experiments. But I'll be primarily talking about some of our work on chemomechanics of interfaces in batteries today. So this is a nice image here, I think. It'll help us understand a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. This on the left here is a schematic of an 18650 battery cell, which is just a typical cell you would find actually maybe in a Tesla or other electric vehicle. It's about, you can see a scale bar down here, not too large. And what's inside this are different layers of materials. So you have an anode and a cathode material. You have a liquid electrolyte that transports ions with your battery. So if you zoom in and look at one of these electrodes are made up of a bunch of particulate materials. And what this schematic is supposed to show is that if you go to different length scales, here is kind of the electrode length scale. Here we're magnifying one particle, and then we're looking actually down all the way to the atomic scale. At all these different length scales, when you charge and discharge your battery, there's dynamic stuff that's happening. And this, by dynamic stuff, I mean you have transformations of your crystal structure, you have expansion and contraction of your particles and your materials. And what this ends up meaning is that at all these different length scales, these dynamic processes usually end up causing stresses to evolve, stresses and strains. And oftentimes these stresses can be very large, and they sometimes have an impact on the reaction mechanisms themselves. And so understanding the dynamics that occur in these materials inside batteries, and also understanding how mechanics is related to the chemistry during these dynamic processes, is really not an emerging, but a growing area of importance in batteries. It's been around for a while, but it's only becoming more important. So in my group, what I'll show you today, what we do is we use what we call in-situ or operando experiments to investigate and visualize what's happening inside batteries in terms of how the materials are changing during charge and discharge. And then we often relate this knowledge to the electrochemical behavior to try to understand how a battery may be failing, or the chemomechanical behavior, which is often linked to the electrochemical behavior. So I'll tell you about some of our work in this area today. So there'll be two different basically projects that I'll talk about. The first one is related to solid state batteries, and I'll spend most of the time on this. We've done quite a bit of work in this area. And then I'll tell you just a little bit about some of our recent work on active material in batteries and how it can expand and contract in interesting ways that is governed by mechanics. So I'll get started on the solid state battery section. So this is an interesting time to be talking about solid state batteries, actually. just this week, there have been multiple announcements from startup companies about very promising performance of solid state batteries. But what I'll tell you about today is some fundamental understanding that we've gained through some scientific investigations related to solid state batteries. So the whole idea behind solid state batteries is that they could have higher energy density and improved safety compared to lithium ion batteries. So here's just a little bit about what a lithium ion battery looks like. This is a conventional battery that would be in your laptop or your Tesla, if you have a Tesla. It looks like this, where you have a graphite anode. So the graphite is on one side of the battery. You have a metal oxide cathode on the other side of the battery. And you have liquid electrolyte that fills all the spaces between all the particles and traverse. There's a polymer separator in the middle as well that separates the electrodes. And it's not really that important what these materials are, but what you should know is when you charge and discharge, the electrons go out to your external circuit to do work, and ions travel back and forth inside the battery. And the ions, the lithium ions, are inserted into the graphite and removed from the graphite, or simultaneously inserted and removed from the other material. And so this goes back to these processes where when you're inserting an ion into a material, it's a chemical process, a chemical change that can cause an expansion. And when you take it out, it causes contraction, and that leads to mechanical issues often. So this is what a lithium ion battery looks like. So the whole idea of solid state batteries is we remove this liquid that's everywhere. We remove it entirely, and we replace it with a solid material that still conducts ions. So the key is the liquid electrolyte has to conduct ions. So this is a schematic of a solid state battery. You can see that there's the solid electrolyte separator that's separating what I'm showing now is a lithium metal anode and a composite oxide cathode. And the advantage of this, number one, is that you're removing this liquid, which happens to be flammable. So often when you've seen videos on YouTube or whatever of batteries exploding, the liquid electrolyte that's flammable has a lot to do with that. So by removing this liquid, there's an advantage. The other advantage here is you're seeing that we're using this lithium metal anode. Lithium metal is pure lithium, and it has the highest capacity possible for an anode, and it's the ideal material to use in a battery if you want to minimize space and weight. But for various reasons, we can't use it in liquid cells as of now. And the thought is if we move to solid state cells, it would be more appropriate, and we could figure out how to use lithium and control lithium. And so I'll talk more about this, and there's a lot of issues there, but for now, that's what we need to know. And so the idea here is we move to the solid state architecture, no liquid lithium, or no liquid electrolyte, a lithium metal anode, and it would really boost our energy density. And we could use this in electric vehicles to drive longer ranges, or we could even start thinking about emerging applications like electric flight or hybrid electric flight. So it's a really exciting prospect. So of course we don't have, we have some test level solid state batteries now from these companies as of this week, but there's still a lot of fundamental challenges associated specifically with solid state electrochemical interfaces. And it turns out that mechanics is a huge issue here, and it's very interesting actually. So I've listed some of the challenges here, and this schematic is helpful. So this is a schematic that shows a conventional liquid electrolyte battery before cycling and after cycling. And what we're looking at is a specific interface in the battery. So we're zooming in and we're looking at the lithium metal in a liquid electrolyte in contact with this liquid. So after we've cycled, the lithium metal has changed. Maybe it's been stripped and deposited a few different times. There's an interphase that grows at the interface. This is a new phase that grows because it's unstable chemically. But the key is you still see that there's contact because the liquid can flow and contact this metal regardless of how it changes its shape, right? That's very important because this contact allows for ions to be transported between the two phases. So if you have a solid electrolyte in contact with lithium metal, when you charge and discharge, you strip and you deposit your lithium, it can change its shape, as I've shown here on the right, and we still have an interphase that forms because of instabilities. But now if you change the shape too much of your lithium metal, you no longer, you lose contact because, again, you don't have a liquid electrolyte. You have a solid material that doesn't flow, right? And so mechanically, this is an issue, this loss of contact at interfaces. There's also other issues, though. You can have lithium that grows directly through the solid electrolyte and basically forms a crack. We call this a filament that grows, and it mechanically fractures the electrolyte and can grow all the way through and short circuit your battery. there's all sorts of mechanical, chemomechanical issues that can happen. So the interphase formation is also an issue. If the formation of this new purple phase that I'm showing here happens if there's too much of it, or if it happens in a way that's not appropriate, then that can also damage the battery. And I'll show some data related to that a little later. So fundamentally, these solid-solid electrochemical interfaces where you have to change the electrode by definition because you're inserting and removing ions, but you want it to remain as stable morphologically as possible. This is an issue. So our objective in my group is basically understand how this interfacial evolution is correlated to degradation and failure mechanisms. And to do this, we need to use techniques that let us visualize what's happening at this interface. So I won't go into the details here, but this is some recent work. So the first thing I'll talk about here is related to contact at this interface and evolution of contact between a lithium metal electrode and a solid state electrolyte. So this is from 2 papers last year that have been very important in the field. Basically, they show electrochemical evidence shown here in these plots. And again, I won't tell you the details, but they show electrochemical evidence that there are voids that form at interfaces. So as you strip lithium metal from a solid electrolyte interface, ideally you just want to remove the lithium and then compress this metal electrode to retain good contact. But under a wide variety of conditions, instead you see voids that form. These voids have not been detected. These are just postulated to form based on this data. And this is the idea basically. So if you have lithium metal in contact with an electrolyte, and you strip the lithium metal, what I mean by stripping is you oxidize it to form an ion that then travels into the electrolyte. That lithium metal has been stripped from this location, and to remove that, or you have to replace that ion by either mechanically deforming the metal that's behind it to fill this void, or by self-diffusion of lithium to fill this void. And so if your rates or your fluxes of self-diffusion and deformation are lower than that of basically oxidation, then theoretically you should form voids. And again, this is evidence that suggests this, but nobody had really shown it. So that's what we set out to do. We have done some synchrotron imaging of solid state batteries to specifically understand how these interfaces evolve. And so this paper was recently accepted for publication. And as I mentioned, this is I'm excited. This is the first time I've talked about it at a talk. So basically, we made these specialized solid-state battery cells. They have a solid electrolyte, which is this material here, lithium tin phosphorus sulfide. We call it LSPS. And then lithium metal is on both sides of the solid-state battery. And so we can cycle lithium metal back and forth. And so we basically charge the battery in one direction and then reverse the current and do the same thing in the other direction. And we take tomographic images every 15 minutes or so during this process. And so we're tracking in 3 dimensions the structure of the battery as we're cycling it. So there's a lot of data. Each one of these lines represents a time in which we collected the tomographic data. That's a 3-dimensional data set. That's very large, many tens of gigabytes. So this rapidly increases or fills up your hard drive. So here is some example data of what this looks like. This is a 2-dimensional view, just one image slice. This is actually one video slice from our battery. On the top and the bottom, you have lithium metal in contact with this big solid electrolyte in the middle. And so what I'm showing you actually is the video over the full 10-hour experiment that the electrochemistry is shown here on the right. We're applying a current of 1 milliamp per centimeter squared. And the thing that's most noticeable at this scale is this darker region that grows at the bottom. That's when we're reducing. So we're reducing the bottom here, the bottom electrode, and we're growing this darker region. We then reverse the current, and you can see that the darker region grows at the top in the second half of the experiment. So what we're doing here is actually by applying a current, we're reducing the solid electrolyte, and we're forming this interphase. There's a new phase that's forming. And in fact, we've analyzed this in detail, and we're not depositing lithium metal. Instead, we're just reducing the solid electrolyte. If you look carefully, though, you can see how, especially at this top electrode, you can see that the lithium metal itself shrinks as we go through this experiment. We are stripping the lithium metal. So we're oxidizing lithium, it's disappearing and being transported across the cell to be reduced at this site. So this is kind of an overall view of what's happening in our cell. And it's also kind of interesting to see that the whole cell is flexing. So there's these mechanical displacements that are occurring within the battery cell. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So now I'm zooming into one interface. So this is the lithium LSPS interface before any cycling. So LSPS is the solid electrolyte. And you can see that the lithium has a darker contrast than the LSPS. This is because lithium is very light. In fact, lithium is generally quite difficult to image with X-ray imaging. And so we used, this is a monochromatic beam at about 28 keV. And we see that in these solid state cells that we've designed with very thin outer holding regions, that we can actually basically see the lithium. We can segment out the lithium due to its contrast. So this is before cycling. After cycling, what I just showed you, we actually see that we can visualize these voids that have formed at the interface. And the voids have a much lower contrast. I mean, it's the absence of material, or there may be gas that fills the voids, but you can see just visually here that we can see the difference between lithium and the voids. We also, we've analyzed a lot of data through segmentation routines, and you can see here, this shows kind of a line scan of image intensity across this interface before cycling. Then after cycling, you can see this a similar line scan gives us this big dip right where the void is. So we can create a threshold intensity to basically segment out with segmentation routines where the voids are across this two-dimensional interface. So these are just individual images. These are example line scans of intensity, but you can imagine we can analyze all the intensity across our whole battery in three-dimensional data set, and really it's a rich data set that allows us to determine where the voids are forming across the whole interface. And that's shown here actually. So here is just a subvolume that shows the interface between the lithium metal and the solid electrolyte. And so I'm not showing you the lithium metal. The lithium metal is on top, and so it's transparent. We're looking through it. But what we see here is in purple, these are where the voids are. This is where our segmentation routines with this threshold image intensity has shown us where there's a lack of material. And so this is the pristine interface here. It's before stripping, I should say. So there's some voids. That's just because the interfaces aren't perfect when we make them. And as we do this experiment, we are stripping lithium. We're removing lithium from this top electrode that's invisible. And after a certain amount of lithium has been stripped, there's not really a lot of changes. But after we strip more, you can see there's a dramatic increase in the amount of voids at the interface. So we're actually visualizing where these voids are. And so this is what it looks like if we plot this against the electrochemical data. So this is the same electrochemical data we saw before, with we're stripping on the top interface in the battery, and then we're stripping on the bottom interface. And the interesting thing about this data is the voltage remains pretty low as we're stripping at the top for 5 hours, and then we reverse the current, we strip at the bottom, and as soon as we start doing that, the voltage starts increasing faster. And at the end of the experiment, actually, the cell polarizes all the way to -4 volts. So there's a big increase in the voltage of the cell. This basically means our cell impedance is increasing, and our cell has died, basically. But the question is, why has this happened? So now I've also plotted on this plot the surface area, or I should say the contact area. So now we extract all the voids as a function of time for every three-dimensional tomographic scan. And we plot for the top interface, the surface area that's in contact at the interface, and then for the bottom interface, the contact area. And we can see the top interface doesn't really change, actually, but the bottom interface is fairly constant for most of the experiment. But then right as we're at the end, when we're polarizing dramatically, that's when our surface area, or contact area, decreases a lot. And so there's this correlation between the decrease in contact area at the interface and the cell failure, basically. And so this plot shows the overall contact area. Now, this is a map of the contact area. This is a very nice data set, I think, when we look at it this way. So this is the bottom interface now. And so in the beginning of the experiment, we have all these yellow pixels are where we have contact. And as we go along, again, for most of the experiment, there's not that much change. It's a little bit of a decrease, but not that much. And at the end, we dramatically decrease our contact area. And if you like videos, this is a video that shows that decrease with all basically the frames on top of each other. So the white pixels are where there is contact at the interface, at this particular bottom interface. And you can see at the end right here, we lose contact. And this is because these voids are forming, because we're stripping lithium too fast and not replenishing it. And so we're losing contact. So I think this is important just to put this in context. It's been very difficult there's been no experiments out there that have been able to visualize dynamic contact at these buried interfaces like this one has. So we're very pleased with these results. So a little bit more about this contact area loss that I think is quite interesting. So it's actually not just the fact that we're losing contact area that's causing the cell failure. So I highlight some modeling work that Professor Mukherjee, who introduced the seminar today, did for this. And basically what this shows is if you don't consider the location of the contact or the shape of the contact area, and you just consider the raw contact area, you do not predict that you have this massive increase in voltage and this cell failure. But you have to think a little bit more subtly. And what's happening here is not only are you losing contact, but you're forming all these very small contact spots, these disconnected, isolated spots. And that's what this plot shows, actually. So we've quantified the area of the contact, and it's a little bit of a weird way to look at this, but basically you start with large contacts here and you end with small contacts. 100% of your contacts at this interface at the end of the experiment are less than 0.02 millimeters square in size. And so this small contact actually leads to what we call current constriction and constriction resistance. And what this means basically is that when you're forcing current to run through this smaller area, when it's coming from a larger area, it's like this water going through a pipe, basically. You have a much higher resistance to that flow. And this can be modeled as well. We're working on that, actually. So basically, it's very important to understand the shape of the contact. Okay, so I have a little bit more to say here. I guess I only have about 5 more minutes left. Is that right, Sabarjit?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to, I'll do a little bit of improvisation here. That's no problem. This is something that I've talked about before. I just wanted to briefly touch on some other dynamics that are occurring in these batteries. So I just told you about this contact area loss. This is a phenomenon that occurs widely in solid state batteries, and we've shown now that we can visualize it operando and analyze it. So there's also this problem of interphase growth. So I won't, this is actually with a different material. I'll just skip through here. But what I'm showing here now is some experiments on a different material. This is a material we call LAGP. It's a solid state electrolyte again. It's an oxide material. It's a little bit easier to work with. And what we've analyzed in these experiments is how this interphase formation that I showed you, we visualized this previously on a few slides ago. It's this region that grows when we're reducing the material, how this interphase formation affects chemo-mechanics of your battery. This is an SEM image of a ceramic solid electrolyte pellet that has been in contact with lithium metal. And you can see that this darker region here has grown. So this is just an in-situ image after an experiment. And this darker region is this interphase. So it's this other phase that's forming at the interface. This particular material grows, this interface grows quite a bit. You can see that this is very thick. And so ideally this would be thinner, but this is a good experimental material to work with. So I'll skip through this. What I want to show is we basically have analyzed this interface formation in great detail. So this is an experiment that uses in-situ electron microscopy to actually, at very small length scales, look at one tiny crystal of the solid electrolyte material and understand how it reacts with lithium metal. So we do this inside a transmission electron microscope. And the first thing to notice is when it reacts, it becomes amorphous. That's what we see with this diffraction pattern down here. Second thing to notice is when it reacts, it expands in volume. And so if you look closely right there, you see a little bit of an expansion. And so this is very important. So you're actually incorporating lithium into the material and it's expanding. So that's going to generate stresses. What we've done here, so we looked at this at small length scales with TEM, and we also did some more X-ray imaging actually to understand how this interphase growth affects cell failure. So it's similar types of experiments that I showed before, except here we're actually using a lab scale X-ray tomographic instrument that's in Chris Saldana's group at Georgia Tech, who's an expert in X-ray imaging of various materials. So so long story short here, what happens is we cycle these same type of cells. This is a different material, and we actually see a different failure mode. What happens in these cells is we never get to high enough current densities to create voids at the interface, actually. So where it's a different failure regime. Instead, what happens is we see, so this is basically a single image slice from the solid electrolyte as a function of time as we're cycling it. And you see these dark lines that grow. So these lines are cracks. This material is fracturing into a bunch of pieces. This bottom image set is actually the segmented fracture pattern at each time. So basically, we're just looking at the cracks here. So we see this spider web-like crack network that grows. And so these cracks increase the impedance of the material. So again, here's a nice video. Here we see these cracks forming. This is larger length scales than we were looking at before. But a very important result from this study was that we found that, so this is basically a plot that shows the impedance of the cell in blue, and then the damaged area, basically the extent of fracture in the cell in red. And what we can see is, as we're cycling the cell in this region here, it takes a while to initiate the first crack, basically. And during that while, there is very little impedance increase in our cell. And this may not be surprising, but what's happening during this period is that we're continuously growing this interphase region. So that the interfaces are reacting, it's growing continuously, but the impedance of the cell is not really increasing. And so it's not until we start getting fracture and we mechanically destroy the solid electrolyte that we see the impedance increase exponentially. And so there's a clear correlation. The fracture is killing the cell, but the subtle thing here is that the interphase growth itself is not really diminishing the cell performance. So that's the key. We've differentiated between what's causing cell degradation, and it's not interphase growth; it's the fracture. But to finish the story, it turns out that the interphase growth itself is causing the fracture. So even though the interphase is not slowing down ions, basically, or not very much, it's actually causing the fracture to occur. And so in the end, it's the problem. But I'll just highlight this work. So we basically, working with Claudio De Leo at Georgia Tech as well, who has a very nice model for chemical expansion of materials and how that can cause stress evolution. We basically took some of our data, our experimental data of interphase growth. This is an SEM image that shows the edges of a pellet after we've grown the interphase here. And they were able to model this growth through a diffusion reaction type model with finite element method, and then predict the stresses based on some assumptions about material properties. And so there's some error here because we had to make some assumptions. But the important thing here, this is a plot showing the sigma theta theta stress, or I guess over half of the solid electrolyte. This is the interphase that's grown, this expanded region here. It's in tension because it's expanded and it's being compressed by the rest of the material. The rest of the electrolyte is in tension, so that's expected. We see fracture. But importantly, we predicted this stress concentration right at the edge of this interphase. So very high tensile stresses. And actually, in a number of cases, we saw that this is where we see cracks, at least the largest cracks form. And so there's some correlation perhaps between this tensile stress concentration and then what we visualize in the experiment where the cracks start, at least where they start from. So I think unfortunately, I think I'm gonna have to skip the second half. I threw it on there because I was hoping to get to it, but again, this is the first time I've presented the first stuff, so I'll skip that. Let me just show you a cool video because this is really cool. This is totally different, but here, this is a TEM video of these little tiny particles that undergo mechanically driven void growth in a battery. This is another battery type experiment where we're removing lithium and causing void growth in these particles, basically due to the mechanical constraint of a rigid shell. So it's kind of cool. I wish I could tell you the whole story, but this is published here, if you're interested, earlier this year by a former PhD student who was the first author who graduated and is now at Oak Ridge National Lab. All right, so I'll skip through this. Oh, such nice. I had a nice model. We'll skip that.
You have a few minutes, Matt. You can definitely tell part.
Well, yeah. I'll just tell you the basic story because it is cool. So here's the video. Sorry to flip through all these slides here, but the basic idea here is here. so we have these little tiny particles, and they're metal, the metal particles. They react with lithium and they expand. And there's been a lot of studies on metal particles that react with lithium over the years. These are useful for high capacity battery electrodes. But usually what happens is they expand when you put lithium in, and then when you take lithium out, they contract. Because that makes sense. You're removing lithium, the volume's decreasing, they contract. But what we saw here is with these very small antimony particles, instead of contracting, they actually form these hollow structures. And it's because you have with these very small particles, you have an oxide layer that restricts the overall contraction of the structure. And so this is interesting because having a constant outer surface, basically an invariant outer surface, is very important for liquid electrolyte batteries because it allows for reduced side reactions. And we showed this actually in the electrochemistry. We see very good performance. But again, this is the video of the materials delithiating. So we're removing lithium and we see the voids grow. And then we came up with this model. This model is cool. Actually, this model is very cool because I have to say, it was inspired by the other presenter here, Matt Pharr, and also his former co-author, KG Zhao, who originally published a paper about 10 years ago using pressure vessel mechanics to model battery materials and spherical battery materials. So that inspired us here, and we used a spherical pressure vessel model, very simplistic model, to basically try to understand the stresses in the shell and the core of these materials and relate that to what we were seeing with the void formation. And so that's what's shown here. So if you're interested, you can check that paper out. All right, so I will end there. That's the last story. And I just want to say that I hope, there's two things that I hope I demonstrated. The first thing is these in situ and operando type experiments where we visualize reaction mechanisms are quite important, and they can inform engineering decisions about battery materials. The second thing is, this is just more and more important as time goes on. The relationship between chemistry and mechanics, of course, is critical in these high capacity and next generation batteries. So I'll thank my students and my postdocs in my group who have done all this work. So Matthew did the second part, the antimony particles. I have a fairly large solid state team. Francisco, Jack was the first author on this paper. It's just accepted for publication. Jared, Song, and others who have done a lot of great work on solid state batteries. And then my funding sources here. So I'll stop there, and I guess we'll wait for questions to the end here. But I very much appreciate everybody's attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions. So thank you.
Awesome. That was really great. Beautiful images and videos, sort of the anatomy of a battery exposed. Okay, so our next speaker is Matt Pharr. Matt is an assistant professor and just been appointed the J. Mike Walker 66 Faculty Fellow in Mechanical Engineering at Texas A&M University. He's got a courtesy appointment in Material Science and Engineering. He received his PhD from Harvard and performed postdoctoral research with John Rogers at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign before starting his independent career at Texas A&M. His research focuses on mechanics of materials in areas including energy storage and conversion, soft materials, irradiated materials, stretchable electronics, coupled electrochemomechanics, and materials for neuromorphic computing. He has received the NSF Career Award, the Kaneka Junior Faculty Award, the Peggy L. and Charles Britton 65 Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching Award, and the Montague Center for Teaching Excellent Scholar Award. So I know he's a fantastic teacher because he's very patient with explaining all sorts of stuff about mechanics to us. So Matt, all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Sabarjit. Sabarjit's also patient with me, so thanks for that. Okay. So today I'm going to continue on with this theme here of mechanics of materials for high capacity rechargeable batteries. And I'll focus on a few different systems that are high capacity here. This was work with graduate student Cole Fincher, also another graduate student I think is in attendance, Yue Zhang, and collaborations with our MC for today, Sabarjit Banerjee, someone with a similar name to me, George Pharr, and if I have time, I'll get to some recent stuff, unpublished stuff with Ankit Shrivastava from Material Science. And so before I go into the talk of the day, I'll tell a little bit about my background or what we do in my group. We mainly look at mechanics of materials, and we focus on experiments, but we also do some complementary modeling and analysis. And we try to look at systems mainly that have coupling between mechanics and other fields. So that can be chemistry, electronics, electrochemistry, even some biology recently. And another common theme is we break a lot of stuff, either intentionally or otherwise. And so one area of that, of course, is what I'll talk about today. In batteries, we have electrochemistry, we have structural evolution, we have mechanics. Another area is looking at how we can do some chemical treatments or put in some defects and things like that to get interesting kind of fracture phenomena on soft materials. And so in these systems, instead of having cracks go in sort of the way you would expect, in some cases they sort of turn and go sideways relative to that, 90 degrees relative to that. They get stuck, they stably arrest, and so you can realize large stretchabilities and energy dissipation qualities and such. And we're looking at how, trying to look now at how microstructure fits into that picture. We also do a little bit of work, more so on the modeling side at this point, on flexible and wearable and stretchable electronics. So this is how we can integrate hard materials with soft materials, either being polymeric substrates or the human body, skin, organs, etc., to mitigate mechanical issues that arise, and implementing some design strategies to mitigate those issues. We also have some work on irradiated polymers. And so these polymers are irradiated with usually cobalt-60 radioactive material to sterilize them for medical devices. And we'd like to transition, if we can, to other sterilization approaches like E-beam or X-ray radiation. So we look at how the polymer makeup changes and likewise how the mechanical properties change in those systems upon those different modes of irradiation. And then doing the full, now that I just came to A&M, I'm supposed to do some agriculture, I guess. I already do some mechanics beyond just what I do in my backyard, and I do very poorly. We had a freeze recently here, which is not as common for Texas where we are, and it killed most of my crop. But anyway, fortunately, we collaborate with some people in soil and crop sciences that are better at this. And they grow things, different genotypes of plants. For instance, is shown here in this image of sorghum. We test mechanical properties. You can imagine it's a fun composite hierarchical structure, rind, skin, cellular bundles, etc. And it has very time-dependent deformation, sort of poroelastic type mechanics. And we sort of see what genotypes are best for preventing issues of failure in the field when subjected to various environmental conditions like strong winds and things like that. And we also do the opposite, where we grow some sorghum in a greenhouse and have a control group that sort of just sits there with no wind, if you will, and another group that we sort of whack back and forth with big rigs that we build, and we see how that can change genetic traits, so epigenetics, how it can change anatomical features, and also biomechanical properties. But anyway, let's get into the topic of the day, which is lithium-ion batteries. So Matt introduced this. As you can see, this is a kind of old slide. I've been giving this slide for a while now. So lithium-ion batteries are the power source of choice in portable electronics like cell phones, tablets, power tools, etc. And they have use in all electric vehicles. Like this one, you can see I'm sitting in there. This is my car. I wish, actually. This is a Tesla Roadster from about 10 years ago. And I said I've been giving this slide for a while. It's interesting. I looked, you know, this version about 10 years ago could go 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. It could go about 250 miles on a single charge, and it cost about $100,000, which is why I don't have it, of course. And just in the 10 years since then, they're advertising anyway that they're coming out with a Roadster in probably 2022 that goes 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. It goes top speed of 250 miles per hour, which I will never try, but apparently that's what they're quoting. And it goes over 600 miles on a single charge, they're claiming. So you can see how much the technology has progressed in the last 10 years. The advertised price of the car, by the way, is $200,000 or $250,000. So you can also see over that 10 years why Elon Musk is the second richest person in the world or whatever. But anyway, if you take a look inside, this is a view of an iPhone, an iPad, and a Tesla Model S. And these sections in green are the battery packs. So you can see in the portable electronics, they're occupying a huge volume. Of course, there's usually some other electronics here that are removed in this picture. But they're occupying a huge volume, and you still have to recharge them once a day or whatever. Or, you know, during the pandemic, trying to have an electronic babysitter for your 3-year-old once every 2 hours or whatever. And likewise in the cars, not only is it a huge volume, this battery pack in the Tesla Model S anyway is about 600 kilograms. So it takes a huge mass. And so, of course, we'd like to reduce this volume and mass and still maintain the same power capabilities. And so the emphasis on this talk is going to be looking at some candidate high capacity systems and looking at mechanical issues in those systems and hopefully how we can mitigate that. And our approach is to do basic characterization of the mechanical properties of these kind of new materials, or at least they're new in the sense that you start with some material, you put lithium into it, and it evolves continuously in its properties while you're electrochemically cycling. Look at damage that occur in these systems, and then try to come up with ways to hopefully mitigate some of these mechanical issues. And so Matt's sort of given an overview of this. The basic thing to keep in mind here from the mechanics perspective is if you want to have a high capacity electrode, it needs to host a lot of lithium. So when you put a lot of lithium in it, it's going to expand a lot. When you pull a lot of lithium out of it, when you charge or discharge respectively, it's going to shrink a lot. And as a result of that, this can produce damage in systems. So here are some commercially available cathode systems and a high capacity anode system. Basically, you have deformation during lithiation and delithiation. You have constraints in the system, you know, inactive materials around the active materials that are deforming, or you have diffusion limitations through the dimension of your active material, or you can have multiple phases that form simultaneously, and you have sort of coherent strains at the interface that lead to stresses. And this can result in fracture. It can result in delamination between active and inactive particles, for instance. And it can lead to unstable deformation in and of itself in some of these systems. And so I'll show a few examples of that, and I'll probably run out of time, so just cut me off. But and so one way that we make these measurements is we want to characterize what kind of stresses develop in these systems while we're doing the electrochemical cycling. And so we take a so-called wafer curvature system, which is basically a laser split into parallel beams. You reflect off of your sample of interest, your substrate of interest. It goes back into a CCD, and by monitoring the spot spacing of the reflected laser dots here, you can sort of calculate or monitor how much curvature is developed in your substrate, which can be related in sort of these thin film battery electrode on substrate systems to the average stress in your thin film battery electrode. And so as long as we can get this sort of thin film form factor, we can monitor the curvature during cycling. We only need to know properties of this inactive material, just whatever substrate we put it on. And then the only thing we need to know about the active material itself of interest is the thickness. Don't need to know properties per se. And we can monitor the evolution during cycling of the average in-plane stress. And so now we integrate this system with a modified electrochemical cell into which we have a quartz window for optical access. And then we can monitor average stresses that develop for whatever electrode of interest we want to monitor while we're doing electrochemistry, and see how these things interplay. And so here's one example of that. I'll start with some high capacity cathodes, and this is in collaboration with Dr. Banerjee, our MC today. This is work primarily done by Yue Zhang from my group. And on the cathode side, there actually aren't so many good candidates to improve capacity significantly over commercially available systems. So commercially available systems afford around 200 milliamp hours per gram or so capacity. There are only a few candidates that vastly improve that number, even in principle, theoretically, that are known. So one of those is a vanadium oxide, in this case V2O5. And per V2O5 formula unit, in theory, we can host 3 lithium atoms, giving an overall capacity of over 400 milliamp hours per gram. And so this is good, but of course, in all of these systems, at least from my biased perspective, maybe, we need to make sure that the mechanics are good as well for robustness during extended cycling, for instance. And so what's shown here is, well, these background colors are sort of rough guesses of where things are happening. But in red is the potential as a function of time versus lithium, or capacity, I guess. We do galvanostatic charging here, constant current. And we've monitored that, and simultaneously we monitor the stress that develops in the system as a function of time as related to the capacity here. And so what you see is that when you start to put some lithium in, initially you have some kind of phase transformation from this V2O5 structure to something that's lithiated, so-called epsilon, lithium X V2O5 here. And in this, you start to develop some compression. So remember here we have a film on a substrate. So when you put lithium in, usually things want to expand. So the film wants to expand, but it's bonded to the stiff, thick substrate, and as a result, you get compression. It's constraining the deformation. And so initially, we start to build up some compression. You can see it's on the order of 100 megapascals or so stress. By the way, I should mention this is dense V2O5. So this is sort of no porosity, no binders, no conductive additives, et cetera. It's kind of what's intrinsic to V2O5. Then we continue to lithiate, and at some point here, corresponding to signatures in the electrochemical signal as well, we start to see more and more compression at a steeper slope, if you will. So per lithium that we put in, we're now building up more compressive stress. And then interestingly, eventually, if we lithiate more and more, at some point, this thing starts to turn back over and go to relative tension or less overall stress in the system. And that's because this system is quite strange in some sense, in that one of these phase transformations, as you're putting more lithium in, actually has a reduction in volume. And as a result of that, yeah, you sort of switch the sign on your stress here. But in this highly constrained system that we've developed for these thin film battery here, and in the presence and going to deep discharge, basically, when we then delithiate, you see this thing's relatively flat. We end up with residual stress, and we end up getting damage in the system after just a few cycles. And so how can we, so this tells us about what are intrinsic sort of stress levels associated with the lithiation of V2O5 itself. But how can we mitigate this issue? So one way to do that would be, let's not go to deep discharge, let's just shallow discharge. And of course, we're not going to utilize as much capacity that way, but as long as we're mechanically robust, that's maybe viable still. And when we do that, indeed, it's better. You get more reversibility in terms of the mechanics here. You can cycle more. However, eventually, for our system at least, as fabricated, you start to build up get some cracking after a few cycles, and then eventually you get extensive cracking and delamination after extended cycling. And so still we see some mechanical damage, and this leads to loss of active material effectively, and we get diminishing capacity. So again, this is not a real battery per se, in the sense that we've made this thin film on a substrate highly constrained geometry, but it does tell us about sort of, quote, intrinsic stresses that develop during the lithiation of V2O5. So now we can start to think about how we can design sort of more stress-free configurations. So with open space or nanostructured or different kinds of geometries that can hopefully mitigate many of these issues. Here's another candidate for cathode. This is sulfur, and sulfur has a tremendous capacity for cathodes. One sulfur atom can in principle accommodate 2 or host 2 lithium atoms. And as a result of that, you get about 1,600 milliamp hours per gram. So it's sort of, almost 10 times better than commercially available cathodes. And there's some very complicated electrochemistry and phase transformations that occur in this system. In particular, if you start with solid sulfur integrated usually into a conductive matrix, because sulfur is an insulator, basically. So it's in a carbon matrix or something like that. Then when you lithiate, you initially form some Li2S8, Li2S6, et cetera, that then end up usually dissolving into the liquid electrolytes that are commonly used in this system. And so you have this sort of solid to liquid transformation. You have all these liquid to liquid transformations. But if you continue lithiating, eventually you form a solid phase. What phase you form depends on what conditions you use, basically. And you may have some solid state transformations among various phases or accommodating more lithium, et cetera. And overall here, theoretically, from going from pure sulfur to Li2S, you get 80% change in volume. And so this is really large, and you may just think, okay, we're screwed here. What are we going to do? But remember that some of these transformations, this is a solid, it's becoming a liquid, so I no longer have, stress of which to speak. But then again, we deposit back as a solid. And if while we're in this solid state, we build up enough stress to drive, for instance, detachment from the current collector, then now we sort of lopped off a big piece of this active material and it's electronically isolated and effectively dead. So we still have to be careful that during this whole process, we don't build up big enough stresses that drive damage in the solid state. And so this is, like I said, more complicated from a phase transformation perspective. And UA developed this clever way to sort of image what's happening spatially just by optical imaging during operation, in this case of a so-called catholyte here with sulfur. And here's a video that shows that. So there's some carbon in the background here, and you're going to see some lithiated sulfur start to deposit here. And you'll see that it doesn't form extremely densely, but it gets fairly dense in here. When we delithiate now, it initially dissolves back into the electrolyte, the catholyte. Then there's liquid phase transformations. You can see some color changes in the liquid, and then eventually we redeposit here as sulfur back into the carbon network. And as you can imagine from this complex phase reactions, we also get complex mechanics. And in particular here in the blue is the stress as a function of time. Instead of just going like compression during lithiation, back to zero during delithiation, we get all kinds of bumps. So sort of down, up, flat, up, down, that kind of thing. And the reason this happens is because of these phase transformations. So you start, this green is the EDS signal for sulfur here. So you start with the relatively dense network of this sulfur in your carbon. Between A and B here, that gets dissolved, so we remove sort of residual stress from fabrication. Then we start to deposit the lithium sulfur product back onto the carbon, and this forms sort of these discrete points or islands here initially, how we've done this. And eventually these things densify and sort of push on each other. So if you're familiar with sort of thin film nucleation and growth type processes, you see the signatures of that in our stress signals, sort of compression, then tension, then compression again. After a lot of lithiation, we actually get this flat region around 10,000 seconds or so in the plot here that may be indicative of plasticity. Then we reverse the process, we delithiate, we dissolve back, we sort of relieve a lot of the stress. Lots of stuff happens in the liquid phase, and in the end, we redeposit as sulfur, and again, we get this signature of tension and then compression that's somewhat indicative of a thin film nucleation and growth process here. So we do build up significant stress here. It's not completely reversible. I'll use that term loosely here because we have these phase transformations, but we do have some residual stresses that are developing during one cycle here. However, during subsequent cycling, we see relatively reversible mechanics. So this is promising for sort of long-term stability of these from a mechanical robustness perspective. Okay, and the last thing I'll talk about here, and I'll run out of time at some point, so please cut me off, but I'll move into anodes, and this is tying in more to what Matt was talking about in the previous talk. And so I'm going to talk about pure metal alkali metal anodes here. So lithium, sodium, and potassium. And the reason we care about these, as introduced, is that for their respective rechargeable ion battery systems, these are sort of the best anodes that you can have. So highest theoretical capacities, lowest negative electrochemical potential, et cetera. Sodium has some renewed interest recently because it has potential for grid scale energy storage. So of course it's heavier than lithium, but if you're not transporting it around, sort of just stick it in the ground, then we don't care as much about mass necessarily. There we care more about reliability and cost and that kind of thing. And sodium's, of course, much more abundant, especially geographically. And potassium's more in a developmental phase. Let's play around and see what happens. Some people have surmised that you can have low fabrication costs and make cheap batteries and such. So that's good things. Bad things, there are a lot of them, some of which was what it was alluded to. You form these sharp features, so-called dendrites in the system that can lead to short circuits, thermal runaway, safety issues, etc. You can also form this, what we said, porous growth here. You can form these regions that can become electronically isolated sort of within even a deposit here. And these can, of course, consumes capacity. It's sort of dead regions, and it can get worse, exacerbated as you cycle more and more. And so I've already said these sort of sharp features that already suggest unstable type of deformation. So we're already thinking of mechanics. And likewise, maybe in these porous kind of things, are we getting detachment from each other? Are we fracturing, et cetera? So the electrochemistry in these systems, think about Elon Musk trying to, of course, he doesn't want to do it, I guess, but certain people, if you can realize these lithium metal or sodium metal pure anodes, that would be tremendous progress in terms of capacity. So the electrochemistry, of course, received a lot of and continues to receive a lot of attention, but mechanics is, again, less studied in these systems. And so our approach again here was we need to learn some basic properties of these metals themselves. They're not extremely well characterized in and of themselves. And then get into the electrochemistry side. So I'll basically just show the pure mechanical measurements at this point. Why we care about more reasons why we care about mechanics in these systems. Here are a couple of examples. It's been found in some systems that if you deposit lithium onto relatively hard and stiff substrates, you form sharp features, a la dendrites. Whereas if you do this on more compliant substrates, you form smoother features, which are desirable. Likewise, if you apply pressure to sort of stacks of these battery electrodes, it's been found that you get denser deposition, sort of better electrode deposition when you apply larger stack pressures. And so what's driving this is one thing we'd like to know. Another thing is that of course, we'd like to prevent the formation of these unstable dendritic structures. And so one way you can think about that is, all right, I'm going to form this dendritic structure if I have a liquid electrolyte, but what if, as Matt alluded to in the last talk, we have a solid electrolyte or a stiff separator in contact with that lithium metal anode? Can I sort of flatten out the thing that wants to form the protrusion? And so just intuitively, I need something stiff to do this, right? And so there are there's renewed interest in this, so there are lots more involved models, but one of the original models was, okay, we'll go through this whole song and dance, do the whole analysis, and sure enough, you find that if your separator or solid electrolyte has about twice the modulus of the anode itself, then you should be able to prevent the formation of these dendrites. This doesn't quite work, of course. But it begs the question of what are the mechanical properties of the lithium metal anode itself, and we need to know things just beyond the elastic or shear modulus, by the way. Another thing that's of interest is that we'd like to know something about length and time scales. So there are these nice studies where electrode deposit of lithium through a capillary tube. Initially, you get relatively dense deposits, but then in some time or at some specified length here, you start to form these more unstable, truly dendritic type structures. And of course, these have different relative feature sizes associated with them. Likewise, as Matt introduced in the last talk, it's very important to maintain interfacial contact between your metal, this is sodium metal here, and your solid state electrolyte. It's been seen that you can form voids after plating and stripping. That includes and increases the resistivity, of course, and likewise leads to localized currents that sort of go around these voids and such. And so it's been suggested that if you can, have a liquid or something that flows readily to fill back in these voids, that would be something desirable. And so looking at the time-dependent deformation mechanics of these metal anodes or metals themselves becomes important. Now, we need to be able to test these things, and these things are very reactive in air. So a graduate student, Cole Fincher, built a tensile tester to go in our glove box so that we can test these things in an inert environment. Likewise, we integrated a nano indenter to do small-scale mechanical testing in an inert environment. These don't have temperature capabilities, so we also built something outside of the glove box into which we have a chamber that can hold mineral oil. And when we put the lithium or sodium under this mineral oil, it prevents oxygen and moisture and things from getting in there for many hours or days, that kind of thing. So we can do this test now with a circulator at various temperatures to sort of fully characterize these metals. So here's the first set of experiments we did. We did bulk tensile testing. We did some nano indentation of sort of as received lithium metal foil. Here's stress strain curves. You can see extensive plastic deformation. You can see that these things flow at really low stresses. We're talking 1 megapascal or so for lithium. You'll also see this marked strain rate sensitivity. So if we go at different loading rates, i.e. if we apply different currents, that kind of thing, you get different levels of flow stresses. And we can fit to these so-called power law forms and things and get stress exponents and start to think about what deformation mechanisms are at play here. We also do this for sodium, in this case in compression. Here you see really low flow stresses, 100 kilopascal or so. This is a really soft material. And again, we can do some constitutive fitting and such. Then we did sort of more systematic things on lithium, sodium, potassium, various rates, various temperatures of importance to real battery applications. So, 0 to 50 or so Celsius. And again, if we go to lower temperature, we have a markedly increased flow stress again. And this is just comparing. So I said lithium is very soft. Well, you can see sodium and potassium are even softer. So I'm getting short on time. We can now move toward constitutive models, start to think about deformation mechanisms. Are things driven by interface or dislocation core type diffusion mediated plasticity, or are we getting sort of lattice diffusion? And then the last thing I'll talk about before I run out of time is that we also want to know the properties at small scales. So remember, when we're forming these dendrites, they form at relatively small length scales, and then they grow into larger and larger structures. And in many materials, the properties of the material are different at small scale. And so we do this nano indentation in the glove box, and sure enough, we see significantly higher hardness when we go to lower and lower depths of indentation, i.e. we're probing smaller volumes of the material, which is like probing effectively smaller materials, if you will. And so this has implications for the sort of onset of the growth of the dendrite. It's going to have some set of properties, and as it grows, it's going to evolve in those properties. We also still see this strain rate sensitivity at small scales as well. So we do this for all the materials. We see this so-called size effects in all three, lithium, sodium, potassium. Do this across multiple length scales, nano indentation, micro indentation, macro scale testing. And we also do some creep tests. So this is nano indentation. We load up to a specified depth, we hold the load, and then we monitor how the indenter moves at a constant load there. And you'll see significant creep of the indenter because of the creep of lithium metal. It continues to creep significantly here. And that might be expected. The melting point of lithium is 180 Celsius, so you're at 2/3 of the melting point in absolute temperature. So we should expect some time-dependent plasticity happening here. Likewise, sodium's even lower melting point. We get even more creeps. Potassium's all the way down at about 60 Celsius melting point. So at room temperature, we get significant creep. And this may have implications, as I suggested, for filling in voids, making good interfacial contact, that kind of thing, as we're pursuing other sort of battery chemistries here. This I don't have time to talk about, I think, but we also did some analysis of the ultimate failure of lithium. It's really sort of textbook, extreme, sort of perfect ductility. We neck down to almost a single line here. We see almost no evidence of voids, and we have some modeling and evidence that there's a local strain that's actually causing the ultimate failure of this material here. So last, I'd like to acknowledge, this is my group back before COVID, and with some different members that have come and gone here. some funding sources in SF and A&M and T's. This top row of names is graduate students involved in this project. The middle row is undergraduates, and the bottom is collaborators, faculty members at A&M. So with that, I will just leave the summary here, and we can take questions.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Matt. So we definitely have time for a bunch of questions on both the talks, and please feel free to keep typing questions. We've got a whole bunch. I'm going to start with the first one, which is from KG Zhao to Matt McDowell, right? So Matt, does solid electrolyte always change its volume during lithium transport? And this is with reference to the LAG-PTEM experiments you showed, where there were significant changes in volume. Does that always have to be true?
Yeah, good question. So if you remember back to that video, I showed you the reaction process between that single little particle and lithium metal. And so that's actually different than what we want. We want there to be no reaction, actually, but I didn't really get into the details here. Virtually all solid electrolyte materials do show a reaction. But the transport of lithium ions through the solid electrolyte is a distinct process. So that should happen without any volume change, really, because there's no change in the concentration. But so this reaction process to form an interphase is a different process that is kind of it's actually a negative for your battery. You don't want it, but it's always there, basically. Oh, you're muted, Sabarjit.
We've got another question from Luis de Vasconcelos. Could you talk a little bit more about the difference between the dynamic area versus 100% or 1% contact area simulation? And they say, the dynamic simulation, the contact area is more than 1%. So what exactly causes the worst performance?
Yeah, so that goes back to I don't know if I should share my screen here. Maybe I should. Just so everybody's on the same page. Where are we? Here we go. All right, so that's right here. This is actually Professor Mukherjee's group did this modeling. So he's here. Maybe you should answer it, but I'll answer it actually. The basic idea here is this model took our. So again, we're modeling basically the effect of the loss of contact at the interface on the electrochemical performance. And so the blue curve is the experimental data. And then the model considered the shape of our battery and the various phases that the ions are transported through, as well as the kinetics of reaction at the interface, the Butler-Fulmer kinetics. What it did not consider is the actual shape of the contact. So it did not consider the fact that we had these isolated contacts. It just considered the overall area being reduced. And so because of that, even when you go to 1% area or this dynamic area, which is a little different, we're just kind of artificially changing the overall area, but it's still a continuous area. And we show that even if we artificially change to very low areas, we still can't match the experiment. And that's because of this fact that we don't have we think it's because we don't have a continuous area. In fact, we have isolated contact spots. So that is what that was referring to. Maybe I hope I did that right, Partha. Is that correct?
Yes, very good. And Lucy, if you need more discussions, I'm here. Thank you.
So the Purdue Mafia, yeah. So James Burrow has a question. Does the interface continually grow, or is it terminating like the SEI in liquid cells? So at what point does the lithium plate on the counter electrode or cathode?
Yeah, this is a very important question. So this is something that we've looked at quite a bit. So there's a lot of corollaries between the solid electrolyte interface that grows and then the solid in a solid state system and then that in a liquid system. In both systems, in both types of batteries, you have these instabilities at interfaces. The key for the solid state batteries is what we want is we want an interface that grows and then basically self-arrests, stops growing. And to get that, what you need is particular properties in your interface. You need to have an interface that's ionically conductive, but electronically insulating so that you can't continuously shuttle electrons through to continue the reduction process. So it turns out that many of these interfaces are electronically conducting, and that's when we see the continuous growth. But there are also other materials like LLZO, some other solid-state electrolyte materials that form very limited interfaces that are either kind of kinetically passivated or even thermodynamically inhibited, arguably. So yes, it's a very critical issue, and the properties of the interface are very important.
Very good. And along the same lines, Bhairav Vishnugopi has a very similar question. He says, the interface is formed between lithium and the solid electrolyte. You expect most of the chemo-mechanical action to be taking place between lithium and the interface as compared to the interface and the solid electrolyte? And are there sort of any potential pathways to modulate ionic and mechanical properties of the interface to control its stability at this interface with lithium metal?
Yeah, another really great question. So again, there are quite a few solid electrolyte materials that do form an interface, virtually all of them. And we've thought about trying to control the morphology of the contact specifically to create kind of beneficial volume expansion at the interface, maybe to induce compressive stresses in regions to arrest cracks and things like this. We have not pursued that really, but I think the idea of if the interface is going to form, trying to create a structure that allows it to form in a beneficial way, whether it's mechanically or ionically, I think is a great fundamental idea.
Very cool. I have a question for you, Matt. So when you had some beautiful images of pores, some of the latest work that I guess is forthcoming. Do you have any idea why pores form where they do? Like, is it local electric fields? Are they truly stochastic? Is there some roughness in the surface? Also, sort of connecting to Matt Pharr's work on, surfaces. Yeah.
Yeah, so we actually analyzed. So if you probably didn't look at the details, but our interfaces were quite rough. There were asperities, and we analyzed in detail if there was a correlation between void formation and roughness, or kind of the quantified roughness of the interface, and we didn't find any. So we couldn't really tell from our experiments if there was a correlation. But I will say that this relates to the other Matt's presentation. So it really comes down to mechanical deformation in many cases, because if you're stripping your lithium fast enough so that you're stripping faster than it can be replenished by self-diffusion, then you have to mechanically deform the lithium to get it to fill that small void that wants to form. And so the properties that the other Matt showed, mechanical properties, and so all these cells are under a stack pressure. So understanding how the structure of the interface, the extent of the stack pressure, and the mechanical properties determine deformation as to prevent void formation is really important.
Very cool. And so perhaps the final question for you along the lines of stack pressure and such, what did you think about QuantumScape? Were you left wanting for more information?
Yeah, so this is in regard to the newly announced data from these startup companies this week for solid-state batteries. Very impressive data for sure. I think all of us were really impressed, but there are definitely some other things we'd like to see as well in terms of well, the scale up is going to be difficult, but also there's some other questions about the data that it's not they didn't publish a scientific paper like some of the other companies have done. I mean, it would have been a little easier to determine all the details if that was the case.
Fair point. Okay.
Sorry, Partha, you're breaking up kind of.
You're breaking up, Partha. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So what do you think about solid power? They announced next day.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty exciting. Multiple companies have really impressive solid state data now. So again, we don't know all the details, but it's quite exciting.
Cool. Okay, so moving on to Matt Pharr. KG Zhao has a question. So, okay, lithium, sodium are complex. What is the key takeaway for electrochemists that they should know about the mechanics of lithium and sodium?
Well, one thing, maybe this is obvious, but these things are very soft, right? So a lot of the initial sort of models and things are doing elastic analyses, which are more or less not very relevant to a lot of real conditions. These things are flowing at stresses that are megapascal or less. So if you noticed on that stack pressure slide, the stack pressure that actually densified the network of the deposition is below a megapascal. So this is relevant because you can't apply infinite pressure to these stacks in sort of commercially viable batteries. So that sets a sort of representative stress scale that you need. That's one thing. Another thing is that these things are deforming all over the place. So, you think you got one thing 1 minute and move somewhere else the next minute. So this has implications. I won't go into too many details because it's a collaboration with somebody, but this comes into, can we make sort of liquid-like interfaces that help flow into some of these voids by using lithium or sodium or potassium, let's say alloys or something like that. So there are a lot of good things that we can do in terms of improving performance from learning just that these things flow in general. Yeah, so I saw another question about, let's see, I'll let Sabarjit ask it, I guess.
Yeah, so Bhairav Vishnu Gopi says, are there any differences in the creep mechanisms between lithium, sodium, potassium? Or are they all controlled by dislocation climb?
Yeah, so for the measured activation energies that we found in the bulk testing at different temperatures of lithium, the activation energy resembles what is predicted, at least, for boundary diffusion. So this could be an interfacial type diffusion, could be grain boundary diffusion, or it could be diffusion along dislocation cores and that kind of thing. For the sodium and potassium, it seems to very much match diffusion-mediated creep, so lattice diffusion. However, that's all a black box, 30,000 foot view. The proof is in the pudding and going into actual deformation, microstructural studies and things like that. So we've started a little, well, we kind of played around with a little bit of that, but we haven't done a whole lot in that area. Eric Herbert from Michigan Tech did some nice studies with indentation, in which he suggests that you get a transition at low length scales to large length scales from diffusion type creep to dislocation mediated creep. So there's a lot of ongoing efforts in this area. It's a good question, but there's no definitive answers at this point.
Just to follow up on that, Matt, is it below a certain temperature? Do you see the same thing? Sort of a crossover to dislocation mediated?
So we don't, but admittedly, we only tested 3 temperatures, and we're fitting to something exponential in temperature. So we have 3 data points effectively there. So there are some studies that would be worth looking at where actually the preliminary studies on lithium metal. There's not much on sodium, but the preliminary ones on lithium metal, we thought that they had just completely exposed their lithium to air. But it turns out their measurements are pretty good, but a lot of them are at really low temperature. So it'd be worth revisiting that and looking at that. That's a good point, Sabarjit. Yeah.
Okay. Connor Fear has a question. It seems that potassium exhibits some pretty good advantageous mechanical properties, which may help maintain flat surfaces when stack pressure is applied, flat electrode interfaces. So what is keeping potassium from going big time?
So the last part, I'm not very sure. Probably put that back on Sabarjit or somebody else. But potassium generally is heavier than lithium and sodium, so you're going to have diminishing returns from that perspective. Also, I said it's good to have a liquid, but you don't want to completely melt this thing in some sense, because if you do that, you can sort of go everywhere, right? and cause some issues unless you're careful about things. So it melts at 60 C. That's probably not great here, if I were to guess. That being said, if you can alloy or do some tricks, maybe it's useful. I know for sure that these things are relatively low cost from a fabrication perspective, apparently. My guess, although I'm completely guessing here, is that they have electrochemical issues with their large ion size and that kind of thing. But does anyone else know? Sabarjit or anyone else?
Matt, do you know about? I mean, I don't know much about potassium electrolytes.
I mean, I think as a potassium metal electrode, it doesn't make as much sense just because it's very heavy, as the other Matt said. It's also, as a metal, it's very reactive, even more so than lithium, and it's just really a pain to work with.
Yeah.
We may have set off a fire alarm once in my lab. I won't comment on that.
You work with potassium, you'd be okay. So Professor McDowell, James Burrow has a really good question. He says, from what you implied, is there some sort of thermodynamic kinetic limit for the rate capability of stripping lithium if you want to avoid pitting? So does that mean that you can't speed up self-diffusion? And so how does this kind of check out with the huge rates that QuantumScapes has reported?
Yes, this is exactly right. So there's a fundamental kinetic limit. You can't replenish the lithium faster than it can self-diffuse, so that it can diffuse through itself under conditions of no stack pressure, right? Mm-hmm. So you could speed up the self-diffusion by heating your battery. That's one way. This is also during discharge. That's important to mention. You could also apply a pressure. So as we've talked about, so if you apply pressure, you can bypass the diffusion limitation by causing mechanical, basically creep or plastic deformation to replenish your lithium at the interface. But the last part of this related to the huge rates reported by QuantumScape, it's important to note that as far as I know, they were reporting charge rates, which are really important because you want to have a fast charge for your battery. And I think they quoted 15-minute charge to 80%. Charge is when you're depositing lithium. It's not when you're stripping. So actually, it's fundamentally, there's different problems. So it's very impressive that they got to those rates, but it's mainly because they were able to bypass filament formation and fracture of their electrolyte. It's not related to the pore formation. So the void formation at the interface would be related to when you're driving your car. If you drive, if you go 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, you may strip the lithium too fast, and then your car can't move anymore.
Very cool.
And if you go 250 miles an hour, you also get a hefty speeding ticket. Although I guess if you can afford the $250,000 price tag, you can also afford the speeding ticket. So.
I mean, worth its weight in lithium, right? So, and so I think on that note, so I think we're almost out of time. Thanks for 2 just brilliant talks, and for teaching us how to deal with stress right before the weekend. Any other points from Devesh or Partha? Thanks for organizing this and for bringing this community together. I think this has been super valuable for everybody. Any final closing comments, Partha? No?
Joke this with KG. Ask him if mechanics wins. Currently, mechanics say a lot. So I'll always, I think. So much, all of you. And if you comment.
Thank you, Parth. And first, thank you, Matt and Matt. I think excellent talk, and thank you, Sabarjit, for moderating it. I'll just like to say a couple of things for everyone who is on the call. We will plan to continue this series next semester with some changes, and our first seminar next semester will be January 29th. It will continue on same Friday at 3:30 time. I think everyone have it on their calendar. So at this point, if you think of some excellent candidate who will like to hear and you want to nominate them, irrespective of which school they are participating or outside the school, you can send those nominations to me or Partha and people who are listed on the committee, and we'll try to include them in the series, irrespective of whether they are the partnering institution right now or not. With that, thank you very much. And Ben, you can stop recording and people can stay on. And if you have more questions for